Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and we're very glad that you're joining us again today. Today we are on location at the Lighthouse at the Voluntary Simplicity Conference, where David Korten, among many others, are talking, giving in plenary sessions, panel discussions, lectures, workshops, all on the subject of bringing people to a closer sense of what it would be like to have a simpler, perhaps even more graceful life. And in that light, David Korten is going to be speaking with us. And also, I just want you to know, he is the author of this outstanding book, is got an undergraduate, graduate, PhD from Stanford University, taught at Harvard Business School, has set up business schools across the world, was stationed in the Philippines and Indonesia for over 10 years, and has come to some startling realizations, which are in this book, through the course of his life on the inside, so to speak, about the nature of globalization, what corporate America and the multinationals have been doing to our precious planet, and is now working on yet a second book on the same subject to further our understanding of what's going on and what we can do about it. So David, thanks so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great, great. I really honor your work tremendously. I think it's a tremendous gift to people who are thinking and reflecting on what is going on right now in our world. We see it crumbling in so many ways. Our lifestyle is being challenged significantly by economics, by politics, by social changes, and people are anchorless in a sense.
Yeah.
And you really have helped, I feel, very much so in this book, and you're speaking to correctly diagnose the problems that we're facing.
Thank you.
As a world. Absolutely. Could you just give us an idea? I know I summed things up, but could you give us an idea of what you were seeing when you went from the inside, in a sense, working for the government, working for the Ford Foundation, working for these prestigious universities that had you shift into a different perspective?
Yeah, and it's really kind of a fascinating story because it reflects so much of kind of our time and where we're at.
Part and parcel. Right.
I mean, the striking thing was that as a young college graduate, I made a decision that I wanted to devote my life to going out to work in developing countries to bring to them the benefits of American economics and consumerism.
Technology.
Yeah, because at the time, I was coming from a very conservative background, and I was terribly concerned that communism was sweeping the world, and that the answer was to make poor people rich.
The American way.
The American way, yeah. So, I went off with the idea, I'll help make them more like us so they'll be happier. And, it was a very long journey, but, gradually began to get this devastating realization that, a few people were getting real rich. And, of course, particularly in Asia, the Asian miracles, we're seeing the jet airports come in, and
now
duty-free
what years
shops
were these, David?
Well, I first went to move to Asia in 1978, and it was about 1988 that I really started to look much more seriously. That we've spent so many years at this, and yet. It seemed that, an awful lot of people, that their lives were actually worse, they were harder. And of course you begin to see the mountain stripped of trees, and we like to go snorkeling, in the tropical waters. I mean, it used to be spectacular. And then we began to realize that every place we go, all you can see is dead coral, and there's no fish, and what's going on here? And it's a very interesting kind of indicator. And then you begin to realize, in Asia, the wonderful, deep, rich cultures. And yet you ancient cultures, and great stress on community and family, and then you begin to see those systematically breaking down. More violence and misery, and people competing for survival and so forth.
And you saw that as a direct, perhaps sometimes subtle, but definitely a direct result of the so-called American corporate influence.
Well, no, it was more subtle than that. I mean, it starts with a realization that somehow, things are not getting better the way they're supposed to. Something's wrong. So then start trying to analyze that, and I started looking at some of the data. I mean, the first reaction is, well, somehow it's not working here, but it must be working every place else, because everybody says this is
Sure.
the answer.
Right.
Then begin looking at the statistics, and you realize, no, it's not working other places. That the growing gap between rich and poor, more people living in misery. Then you begin to see that many of the development projects are actually pushing people off of their land. Poor people are means of subsistence, their homes and so forth. So you make way for a power project or a forestry project or something. And almost always is to benefit people who are already better off than the ones that are being displaced.
Yes.
But the real shock for me came when I realized that exactly the same patterns of environmental destruction, increasing inequality, social breakdown, were happening in the United States and in the other industrial countries. And you begin to say, hey, there's something really systemic going on here.
Yes.
So what is it? Unfortunately, I was in a position that I could take time to reflect on that, look at the data, study it.
Right.
And basically came down to two conclusions, or identified two underlying issues.
Mm-hmm.
One is that we live in a finite planet, or on a finite planet.
Mm-hmm.
And the key to life, to the wealth of the planet, are the regenerative systems, the soils, the water systems, the hydrology, the weather systems, the forests, the fisheries,
Sure.
and so forth. All of those
Natural
things
resources.
well, it's natural resources, but it's more the regenerative, the living resources that's the real key. I mean, we're going to run out of oil, and that's going to be, a bit of a problem. But in terms of sustaining life, oil's not that important, but soil is.
Definitely.
Fisheries are, all that stuff, clean water. So, then you realize that what's happening by pushing economic growth is the answer to everything. Essentially, we're continuously increasing our burdens on the regenerative systems of the planet, and that we have come to the point where our demands on the ecosystem exceed what it can sustain.
Yes.
So the more we push growth, what we're doing is two things. One is we're accelerating the breakdown of those systems, the collapse of the fisheries like we've seen on the East Coast. But we're also intensifying the competition between the rich and the poor for access to those resources. And guess who wins?
The rich.
The rich, absolutely. So that's why, a few people are getting richer. We look at that and say, hey, things are going pretty good. But what we don't see are the 80% that are being pushed off the edge.
Now, you made a point in your book of that, when it comes in particular to agribusiness, that so much of the land that is being farmed is for export purposes. And the people who had lived on the land sustainably are not getting even the food that they are themselves growing.
This is one of the...
That is another central piece of it.
well, it's one of the incredible anomalies of our modern economists and their view of the world. That if you produce food for yourself to eat, that doesn't count. That's not helpful. That's not development.
Right.
It's only a contribution to development if you're producing something to export for rich people to eat.
Yes.
Now, it's bizarre, and then you're supposed to import it. Now, why would that happen? Well, it begins to come into the second element of the analysis, the interests of the transnational corporations. And this is what's been happening in society, that where we need to rethink our consumption patterns in very fundamental ways in the direction of greater equity, living well but more simply, with sufficiency rather than excess. What we're doing is, through economic globalization, through deregulation, through forgetting about antitrust laws and so forth, we're seeing this more and more consolidation of corporate power, and more of the decisions about how we'll live, how economic resources will be used, are passed to corporations. Okay, coming back to the farm issue. If you're one of the big agribusiness companies, you don't make any profit if somebody's growing corn and beans for their own, or rice for their own consumption, or they're selling them in the market to their neighbors. But if you can get every country in the world to be producing something that then is exported someplace else, Okay. Then it's got to go through one of these transnational corporations. They begin to control the food supply, and they profit from every single transaction.
Point along the way.
Yeah. So we see in every aspect of life, as you begin to trace it through, more and more of our lives being reshaped in a way that make us increasingly dependent on the corporations so they can extract the profits to pay these extraordinary CEO salaries and to keep pumping up those stock prices for the people who are rich enough to have money in the stock market.
That's right. That's right. And not only are they owning every means of production along the entire pathway, but they're also controlling everything.
Yeah.
And they also are controlling food, controlling the seed banks. I mean, it's actually quite horrifying when you step up the picture and see the entire one. It's
yeah, as you know, they're going into third world countries and they're taking the seed germs and so forth that people have used for centuries, and then patenting them, and then turning them into genetically engineered seeds.
Now, what do you, David, you've been friendly even with some of these people. You've gone through the same schools they have gone through. What is your understanding of, I always look at things ultimately psychologically. Yeah. What do you think is really going on that is creating such a disparity between rational, reasonable, balanced living, which we have had on this planet, as far as we know, for most of human life, human civilization, and what's going on now? How do you understand what is going on psychologically?
Well, that's a very big question. It has many, many dimensions. But
I'd imagine that there might be some kernels or root causes that maybe you have discerned.
Well, I mean, there's so many issues. I mean, there's the whole matter of the institutional systems, and I think this is a terribly important point that I find, you know, within the corporate system, within the financial world, and so forth. I mean, you know, there's some really nasty people, but there are also a tremendous number of people who, you know, absolutely share our values.
That are in the corporate structure, even
you know,
higher up.
Exactly, people who are good friends, who are good family people and so forth, and who care about the future for their children.
Yes.
But when you work within that system, you have very few choices. Now we're also, of course, you know,
this is important.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a CEO with $100 million a year salary, you toe the line, and if you're not putting all of your focus on the bottom line, short-term return to the shareholders, you're out on the street with the rest of the downsized folks. So, you know, you kind of learn to play the game. Now, of course, that's also backed up with an enormous propaganda machine that continually tells us that the way you best serve society is to make profits for the corporation, serve the shareholders. And we've got a whole, you know, a whole profession of economists. That's their job. They're essentially paid propagandists of the system.
In fact, it was in a sense that same trajectory that brought you to want to help developing countries with the American way.
Yeah, that was the story.
It was the same storyline.
I was into this, you know. So okay,
we were raised on it.
We were raised on it. Exactly.
Spoon-fed.
Exactly. Now, of course, there are deeper issues also. You know, the book that I'm writing now, you know, traces a lot of this back to the scientific revolution and the whole worldview that came in with Newtonian physics.
Yes.
And the idea that the universe functions like a machine.
Right. Mechanically.
Mechanically.
Like a clock.
Yeah.
Right.
And that life is simply a kind of an artifact of material complexity. It has no meaning, no reality. It was the most extraordinary thing. It was supposed to be science dealing with, you know, with observation and fact. And what's more fundamental to our reality, to our experience, than life and consciousness?
Right. Exactly.
But no, that's you know, that's just an
and the
illusion.
opening of perception, which is fundamental to scientific inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you can't measure it with a yardstick or a microscope. So therefore, it must not exist. Right. So, you know, the whole story is developed around that, about reality, and it's very striking to me that, you know, in some ways, I think, you know, perhaps Hobbes was our most important or most influential philosopher, with the idea that, you know, since since it's all mechanical, life is a chance artifact. It has no meaning. Therefore, the only conceivable purpose to life is to pursue material gratification as sort of a distraction from the alienation of being conscious with, or thinking we're conscious or whatever.
Yeah, right, or what life might be.
Yeah. So this, of course, plays right into this modern economics. Okay,
Indeed.
Exploit nature.
It actually is biblical when you think about it.
It is biblical.
If you go back to the underlying idea that is put forth in the Bible of man's dominion over nature.
Yeah.
Now that can be, right.
There's that aspect to it.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, one way I came to this was that I was so struck that, you go out and you point out to people, if we continue the way we're going, in terms of our environmental destruction,
yes,
our species is going to become extinct. It's going to be the end of the line. They say, well, yeah, that may be true, but we've got to get on with
business as usual.
Business as usual. And say, well, isn't this important? And then I realized, if you embrace a Hobbesian philosophy, that there is nothing to life other than the party, stopping the party makes no sense, because it may be wrong. I mean, the environmentalists may be wrong. I mean, maybe there aren't any limits, and maybe this thing's going to go forward. So, we'd be giving up the party for no purpose.
Right.
On the other hand, if the environmentalists are right, and the party's over, well, last one out, turn out the lights.
Right.
So,
let's hope the hangover isn't too bad.
Yeah. So, then it begins to become clear how fundamental the spiritual dimension of this is, and the aspect of how do we think about reality and the nature of reality and creation. And, I think we're, a lot of us are coming back to rediscover what in many ways is a very old story, but beginning to think about how we can combine that with the new technology, with the kinds of knowledge that we have, with the global communication to evolve toward a higher level of global intelligence, species intelligence, but not against nature, not for a party,
right,
but out of a recognition that if you really look at the processes of how the cosmos created itself from nothing, it's extraordinary. Right. It's absolutely the reverse of the physics prediction of everything running down.
Yes.
Because if it's really running down, then you're moving toward an undifferentiated mass of sort of gases and just diffuse particles. But in fact, that's the way the universe started, with the Big Bang, and then the whole rest of history is the coalescing into ever more complex and higher forms of organization.
Right.
And then and the emergence of life and conscious life and conscious intelligence and so forth.
Sure.
This is the real direction of creation.
That's right.
And that begins to put our lives in a totally different context of, what is our role in this creative process to become what we can become, to help life actualize itself.
That's right, sure.
From
that point of
you feel a whole lot different, don't you? Than, oh, well, it's, you're just a mistake.
Exactly. Or things are running out.
Really exist.
That's right.
Yeah, that's all.
You're inconsequential.
Yeah, I mean, no wonder youth are alienated. I mean, this is the message they get. Only things consume you are what you consume, what you wear.
It's a very sad message.
It's a very sad
I've been
message.
Decrying the spoils of the advertising industry for a long time. Yeah. And there are publications such as Adbusters that you know of.
Oh, yeah.
Which are just, I feel, leading the way in helping to de-propagandize and decondition us from that reality. Just to kind of, if I can, sum up, or at least touch upon one point that you made that I think is very central, and I've been thinking about this a lot and talking to people about it, is there is a corporate culture. It's not the individuals necessarily at all that are causing the decline of our civilization, quite honestly. But it's a corporate culture, sort of like I've always compared it, David, to a football locker room, where the guys have a certain kind of collective behavior that they would not have individually at all. Some people who play football are actually very intelligent, sensitive, fine, loving human beings, but put together, hey man, how are you? And there's this kind of machismo, bizarre, a herd mentality.
Yeah.
And I feel that has just been placed into, or is being lived in, the corporate culture.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it fits with the idea of competition and so forth.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's an analog.
We're going to trash the competition.
Yeah, exactly. Sack them. you
Yeah.
know. I'd like to pick up here and look at, since you so elegantly laid out our perspective in the universe as this endlessly creative energy, drive toward evolution and greater levels of sophistication and organization. How, from that point of view, do you see us positioned as interested individuals at a conference such as this, a Voluntary Simplicity Conference, as well as people that you and I know that are working toward creating a better world?
Yeah.
What do you see as real practical solutions or avenues for us to proceed upon to deal with what you have also so elegantly discussed in this and your next book?
Well, you've asked another very large question.
I only know how to do that.
Well, there's so many dimensions that we need to work on, but I'm so fascinated by voluntary simplicity as a subversive act. Because the whole thrust of the corporate world and the consumer culture that they try to instill in us through the advertising and so forth is to make us into mindless consumers and mindless obedient workers. Now, voluntary simplicity...
A slave mentality, to get down to it.
I mean, voluntary simplicity is not about, depriving ourselves or, wearing sackcloth and
Figs.
It's about mindful living.
Yeah.
It's about conscious living. It's about getting clear on what things really make our lives worthwhile. And
perspective, proportion.
Yeah, and then freeing ourselves from the dependence on the jobs, the money, and the goods that corporations provide.
That's right.
Now, the book I'm working on right now, the working title is Envisioning a Post-Corporate World. And, if we get beyond the idea that, our well-being depends on having a really big screen television or, spending our lives on airplanes flying around the world, which I can assure you is not
so much fun, right?
Not so much fun.
Yeah.
And begin to realize that the real joy of living comes from the things that we do with friends, with family, with community.
Yes.
It comes from developing intellectually and spiritually in our social relations, artistically. These are not high consumption items. They don't place a big burden on the earth, and they also don't require gigantic corporations to produce them. And that in the the normal things that we need are food, that's been produced locally for since the beginning of time. It's only in the last few years that we've become dependent on these imported products.
Sure.
And of course, the food's a lot healthier if it's not produced with all of these chemicals and so forth. So we begin to realize that we could very well organize our economic activities in ways that are consistent with strong local economies, with a priority not on profits for overpaid corporate executives or shareholders who do nothing but sit on their bottom collecting,
watching the ticker tape,
but rather, engaging people in useful, productive employment, producing the things that we need for a decent life, and doing it as quickly and simply as possible, so that we have lots of time to do the things that really enrich us and really matter. So, that's kind of the broad outlines, and you can go through in terms of every sector and how you'd organize it. You can,
have you given thought to that? The implementation.
Well, we're working on a lot of areas in terms of implementation. The thing that I'm very focused on now is a group that I helped to found called the Positive Futures Network. And we have a journal called Yes, a Journal of Positive Futures. And this whole enterprise is about communicating the story of things are going in a very bad direction. We're on the verge of collapse, And you know, we've got the analysis, we know why, but okay, instead of dwelling on that, okay, let's craft the new story of what, you know, the people are creating. The culture shift is happening. The new values are being embraced. People are waking up. And you know, they're starting farmers markets. They're doing community currencies.
There's a decentralizing occurring.
Yeah, and you know, all kinds of things, and community ownership and, and community enterprises and so forth, which are all part of building a new economy, rebuilding community and so forth. So you know, no one person is creating the model. It's being woven
emergence.
out of this dynamic.
Yeah,
exactly.
that's right.
And
it's interesting because America has so much led the community down this primrose path.
Yeah.
And you know, if you look at the developing countries, India, African nations, etc., they can't get enough American goods. They can't get enough American TV, enough American movies, blue jeans, you name it. And you've been there, and I've been there, and we know that for them, the world is just beginning. I mean, they haven't touched China. The consumerism that we have now known for the past 100 or so years is just embryonic there.
Right, and but that of course is part of the perversion of the system that we're
we have exported
that.
these values,
because
and so
also
here we are now looking to restructure, in a sense, re-socialize, recondition ourselves according to sane values, which actually come largely, based on my orientation, from Zen, which has been saying this all along in simplest terms.
Well, also much of the wisdom and knowledge about how to do it comes from those countries that we're trying to convert into
indigenous cultures.
Exactly.
Exactly. So what do you, I mean, it's almost like the tail of the dog is now wagging, to use an expression.
Yeah.
And here is the rest of us who we've now gone through that cycle, but we've got, you know, 80 to 90% of the world who has not yet gotten there. What do you see as that?
Well, I think partly the message that I bring, you know, before you jump into this, look what it's doing to us.
Exactly. That's that's like a parent, though, saying to a child, avoid this, that, and the other thing, because
right. And that, of course, is why it's why I came home, because it is so important to focus on change here, because we've got to create, you know, to be credible in this message.
Agreed.
We've got to create a new message at home. We've got to lead the way and living differently, to send a message at the same time that we're learning from them as much as we can about how to do it.
Is the irony, I always say, David, that God is really a Jewish comedian doing the Borscht Belt. And the joke is on us.
The joke is on us.
You know? Here we are materializing the universe, creating endless consumption, and then exporting it everywhere. And then we listen with one ear to the great teachings of the indigenous peoples that we have now perverted, corrupted, distorted, destroyed. And yet the answer is always there, even within our own indigenous culture, which I believe exists. Even the white European male comes originally from an indigenous life.
Right.
Well, listen, I want to thank you very much for being on the show. This has been very illuminating.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Great. We've been talking with David Korten, the author of this great book. Really urge you to go out and get a copy and read this, because it will open your eyes to the realities that are before us and breathes life into the possibility of what can happen if we all collectively do something and shift our thinking about life as it comes to us. So thanks so much for joining us. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, for A Better World. Please give a call at 212-420-0800. I love hearing from you. Share your thoughts and feelings with me, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.